Over to you, Jeff.
Let's begin with some auspicious verses of salutation from Nagarjuna's fundamental treatise on the middle. Enthused by great compassion, you taught the immaculate Dharma to abandon all views. To you, the Buddha, Gautama, I pay homage. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 9th installment of the Jeffrey Hopkins Legacy Series with Professor George Dreyfus, Geshe La Rampa. My name is Jeff Allen, and I'm honored to be here on behalf of Buddhist Center, again collaborating with Sravasti Abbey and Institute for Tibetan Studies. Any donations received during the series will go to Institute for Tibetan Studies. There will be a link in the chat box as usual for donation. This will bring you to the Sravasti Abbey donation page, right in the comments section, donation for Jeffrey Hopkins series, and this will continue the internet availability for so many publications on the website, as well as providing funding for future translations. Professor Hopkins left because of impermanence, quite a few unfinished projects, and he worked right up until the end of his life. And just to update everyone, the updated meditation on emptiness has been checked and checked again and is going out to print and will be out as scheduled early next year. So look for that. And I think you can already purchase it on the Wisdom Publications website. And the team worked so hard to make sure that it was just right. The team was led by Boris Simonek, and everybody worked so hard. And I just want to congratulate the folks that worked on that for having such a success working so closely with Genla. After the lecture, we'll entertain a few questions for around 30 minutes. And please post those in the link box found in the chat box, and we'll get to as many as possible. So the same way we've been doing it, put the questions into that place, and then they'll get sent to me, and we'll go over them. So I'm honored to introduce you to Professor George Dreyfus, Geshe La Rampa, Professor of Religion, Williams College. In the late 60s, Professor George Dreyfus, as many young people do, began to search for a higher meaning to life beyond the normal drudgery. Most young people aren't geniuses, but we'll get back to that later. In 1970, he traveled to India hoping to become a great yogi after reading Yogananda's autobiography of a yogi. Not finding the utopia he had hoped to discover, Professor Dreyfus became discouraged and was almost ready to entertain giving in to the dreaded mundane subway work-sleep life when, while sipping chai with a young Frenchman, the young man suggested he try out Dharamsala, where the nice Tibetans were. Luckily, Professor Dreyfus headed north and for 15 years became immersed in the Tibetan culture of philosophical debate and inquiry in the Buddhist Gelug tradition, eventually becoming the first Westerner to earn the degree of Geshe La Rampa. He was also in the first class of students at the Institute of Buddhist Dialectics founded by the precious Genlub Sanyatso. Conditions at this time were far from ideal, and many monks became ill due to insufficient resources. Few of us could even imagine staying there for a few days, but let alone 15 years. His teachers were our teachers' teachers. Both Khenser Pema Jetson and Shakyamuni Nyima were considered some of the best teachers of their generation by His Holiness the Dalai Lama, who acted somewhat like an academic advisor for Professor Dreyfus. Had these lamas and others like Dzong Rinpoche not had the perseverance and big minds that they did, South India would still be fields and stumps without monasteries. After graduating with his Geshe La Rampa degree, Professor Dreyfus entered the PhD program at UVA and graduated in 1991 under the advisement of Professor Jeffrey Hopkins. They had known each other from their common path in India, staying together for a time at the Institute of Buddhist Dialectics. Again, Hopkins would tell our class stories of the two of you debating, shouting at the top of your lungs, even drawing the attention to His Holiness's brother. It drew his attention, who wanted to know why you were both yelling at each other. But this is very normal for Tibetan monastic debate, which is intense and animated, to say the least. Any Western monastic or serious student that studied in India with the older generation of Geshes has heard Western gunslinger-like legend stories of you showing up at the various monastic universities armed with unique points found in competing universities' monastic manuals, and spinning fellow debaters around in circles. So I've heard about this over and over and over again when I was there from 2000 to 2001. After graduating from UVA, Professor Dreyfus published several important books that are considered staples for those interested in pursuing or understanding Tibetan systems of logic and the philosophy of the middle. The Sound of Two Hands Clapping. Very, very amazing book. And then also we have Recognizing Reality. Another amazing, amazing book. And then also the book he co-edited and contributed to, the Prasangika Svatantrika distinction.
Yeah, that's for today.
I'm sorry?
That's for today.
And so this is what we're going to talk about.
Yeah,
today.
but the Svatantrika Prasangika distinction is what I will talk about today. So it's,
yes.
if people want further information, that's what they should refer to.
So this is the book again.
Yeah.
That we're referring to. Okay. And he also published numerous papers, never shying away from addressing some of the most controversial issues, meeting them head on with logic, reasoning, and very little room for rebuttal. Very much inspired by the spirit of non-sectarianism, Professor Dreyfus has studied extensively outside the Galupa school where he received his basic training. He studied and practiced Theravada meditation techniques with Munindra and other qualified teachers, as well as different presentation within the various schools within Tibetan Buddhism. Professor Dreyfus is a professor at Williams College, where he teaches courses on Tibetan and Thai Buddhism, Indian philosophy, meditation and cognitive science, religion and science. One of his main areas of interest is the study of consciousness, an interest that he has developed through an association with the Mind and Life Institute, and actually has his students watch their mind and journal it. Very cool to have a professor prepping students to discover the natural, unsullied luminosity of their mind. Some even get to travel to India with Professor Dreyfus to see the living tradition in action at Sarajay Monastery. Professor Dreyfus is the recipient of various awards, such as a National Endowment for the Humanities. I'm honored to introduce you to Professor George Dreyfus, Geshe La Rampa, to explain the Prasangika Svatantrika debate.
Okay.
That's it.
Thank you. Well, that's more than you should have said, but anyway. Thank you. Thanks everybody for being here. I am very happy to give this talk to commemorate the memory of Jeffrey Hopkins. What Jeff mentioned, my meeting with Professor Hopkins in India. Now, shouting with him was one of the meetings, but I remember the first time I met him, I asked him the question, do you speak Tibetan? And I was just beginning to learn Tibetan. And Jeffrey said, I hope so. And I was like, wow, somebody can speak Tibetan. That's amazing. And then, obviously, I read Jeffrey's meditation on emptiness, which was seminal work to understand the Gelug interpretation of Madhyamika, and in general really contributed enormously to the progress of Madhyamika studies in the Western Academy. And then finally I entered a PhD program at University of Virginia, and so he became my advisor. And so I'm very happy to talk today to celebrate his considerable contribution to the field of Buddhist studies, Tibetan studies, Tibetan Buddhist studies, and so on. Okay, so today, what's my topic? It's the Svatantrika Prasangika distinction difference. So Jeff showed you the book. I highly recommend the book. I think it was the best on the question, may still be. And so that's a really good resource if you're interested in the question. So this Svatantrika Prasangika distinction is a big, big topic in Gelug curriculum, and also in Gelug self-presentation. That is, there is a great deal of emphasis on the primacy, the superiority of the Prasangika view, and this is one of the characteristics that Gelug scholars often cite, which is the reliance on Chandrakirti and on Prasangika as a mark of the superiority in the field of Madhyamika. And so this is very much emphasized that Tsongkhapa is a provider of the right view, which is obviously a very important topic in all Buddhist tradition. And also for Tsongkhapa, what is very central is this distinction between Svatantrika and Prasangika and the superiority of Prasangika. And so much emphasis is put on the superiority of Prasangika in monastic studies in Theravada, Punganden, but sometimes people raise the question, Svatantrika real Madhyamika? And this is a crazy question. This is totally insane, but it shows something, which is the strong emphasis of the Gelug tradition on the superiority of Prasangika. And so this is what I want to talk about. Why is it crazy talk? I should say, because if you think that Shantarakshita is an inferior view to your own Prasangika view, then you have a little bit of a big ego problem, because Shantarakshita was a great master in Nalanda, a central interpreter of the Madhyamika tradition. And so to think that he has an inferior Madhyamika view is pretty strange, to me at least. And this is what I'm going to talk about. So as you can see, I'm not going to adopt exactly the Gelug interpretation of the distinction. I will talk about various ways to understand the distinction. And also I will show what's behind the different view on the difference between the Prasangika and the Svatantrika. Okay, so where does this distinction originate? Well, in a way, you could say it originates with the debate that Baba Viveka has. Now, it's not a physical debate, but Baba Viveka, Bhavya also called, criticized Buddhapalita, who is an earlier interpreter of Nagarjuna, and fault him for his interpretation of Nagarjuna. And then Chandrakirti jumps in and defends Buddhapalita interpretation. So this is one of the source of the distinction. However, it's a pretty distant source, because in India, we didn't really have sub-school called Svatantrika and Prasangika. Now, in the later, maybe 10th, 11th century, you start to see some distinction that people made. But prior to that, people, Madhyamika in India, did not think that Shantarakshita had a different Madhyamika view than Chandrakirti. And so they didn't think that there is a distinction here to be made. And the person who really, they didn't think, sorry, let me correct that. They didn't think there is a distinction to be made in terms of the view of emptiness. They thought there are distinctions. Svatantrika used logic. Chandrakirti doesn't really like that. Okay, and I will talk more about that. This is a distinction. It's not uninteresting, but it's not a fundamental distinction. But what they didn't think that there is a distinction in the view of emptiness, contrary to Tsongkhapa. And also contrary to the person who really created the Svatantrika Prasangika distinction in Tibet, and that's Patapnimadra, who was a translator of Chandrakirti. So it is Patsap who really made this difference between two lines of interpretation and two sub-schools of Madhyamika, the Prasangika and the Svatantrika, emphasizing that Prasangika is the right one following Chandrakirti. Okay, now, so my view, probably a bit controversial, is that this is not really an Indian distinction. There were some differences in India, but nobody thought that they were different in the important points, such as the view of emptiness, and that distinction originating in Tibet with the translation of Tibetan, of Buddhist into Tibetan, and the whole elaboration of the Tibetan scholastic tradition, particularly around Sampo Neotok Monastery. Okay, so the person to pay attention is, in a way, Patsab, but for a talk here, the person to pay attention to is obviously going to be Tsongkhapa, because that's Tsongkhapa who kind of built upon Patsab and made this distinction very important to his own interpretation of Madhyamika, and made the Prasangika, in his view, the most important school of Madhyamika, and particularly emphasized the importance of Chandrakirti. You probably have heard that if you studied the Lamrim. There is, prior to introducing the view of emptiness, there is usually a discussion of the superiority and primacy of Chandrakirti. And so this is due to Tsongkhapa, who really emphasized that difference between Svatantrika and Prasangika, arguing that there is a difference to the view not only in the logic used by the two sides, but also a difference in the view on emptiness. So that's to set up the landscape. So we understand now how this distinction came to be made. It came to be made in Tibet, and it came to be canonized and greatly strengthened and given much more content by Tsongkhapa. And so hence it's a very important element in Tsongkhapa's interpretation of Madhyamika. You can, if you look at the Lamin Chemo, you will see that Tsongkhapa devotes quite a bit of space to arguing about this distinction. Okay, so you may wonder why people made that distinction. What is the issue that support this distinction? This is obviously a question that is very pressing, since, as you have guessed, not all Tibetan scholars agree that there is a difference to the view. So one might wonder, what's going on? Why is there that distinction? So the distinction revolves around a particular issue, which is, to put it very generally, the use of Indian logic in Madhyamika, more particularly the use of probative argument to establish our emptiness, particularly the use of autonomous syllogism, right? Rangyu ki ta, Svatantrika hetu, Rangyu ki Jorwa, Svatantrika payoga, and so on. And so that's the issue around which this distinction is going to be developed in Tibet, and particularly greatly emphasized by Tsongkhapa. So you may wonder what's the issue. The issue is the following. You all understand what a probative argument is. It's an Indian syllogism. I use the word syllogism here in a loose sense of the term. The syllogism goes something like, the subject, the sound, is impermanent because it is produced just as the sound, right? So that has a subject, a predicate, a reason, and an example. And that's a convenient formulation of prayoga, of a syllogism, or what I call the probative argument. So I hope everybody understands what the probative argument is. It's different in Buddhist logic from a prasanga, a statement of consequence, because the prayoga probative argument is committed to express a correct point, a truth. So the sound is impermanent because it is produced. The sound is impermanent. That's a correct syllogism, correct probative argument. A statement of consequence, a prasanga, is not committed to express a true point. For example, you could formulate to the Vaisheshika, who is the adversary that the probative argument I just talked about is addressed. You could address the prasanga saying it follows that the sound is not produced because it is permanent. Now, that statement of consequence is not committed to the truth of the proposition that it announced. It's just a consequence of the view, the position taken by the Vaisheshika. So there are these two tools of Buddhist logic, the probative argument and the statement of consequence. Okay. So what Chandrakirti is going to argue against Bhava Viveka is that we should not use Svatantra Hetu, Rangyukita, probative argument when we establish emptiness. It's okay to use probative argument when we establish impermanence. That's not a problem. But it is not proper. I'm not yet saying there is a problem, but it is not proper. We should not use a probative argument. We should rather prefer a prasanga, a statement of consequence. When establishing, I should make it clear, emptiness to a non-madhyamika, to a realist. So when madhyamika debate among each other, it's quite okay to use a probative argument. But when madhyamika debate with a realist, with somebody who is not introduced to the view of emptiness, they should prefer a prasanga, a statement of consequence, rather than use a probative argument, right? Hope everybody is on board. It's a bit involved, it's a bit complicated, but I think it's going to hopefully be of some interest if you're interested in this kind of issue. So what is at stake in this difference between Bhava Viveka and Chandrakirti? That's the question. What is at stake here? Now, there is a perfectly trivial interpretation of the debate, which says something like, yeah, sure, there is a debate between the two, and clearly Chandrakirti think that we don't need a probative argument to establish emptiness, but we should not make it a big deal. It's actually a relatively small point. If you really insist, I mean, if you really insist that we need a probative argument, okay, go ahead, but we don't think we need that. We think a prasanga is enough. A statement of consequence is enough. But anyway, this is not a big deal because both people who use statement of consequence and people who use probative argument basically share the same Madhyamika view, and it's just in the difference of the logical tools that are going to be deployed when they're debating with non-Madhyamika, right? So this is what I would call a very trivial interpretation of the difference between the two sides. Now, this is not Tsongkhapa's understanding, okay? This is mostly what non-Gelug scholars will explain. I forget exactly the interpretation of Mipam, but it's probably something like that. I cannot vouch for that because I have forgotten, but that's the explanation, a kind of standard interpretation, explanation that would be given from a non-Gelug standpoint. Tsongkhapa think this is missing an important point. Why is that? Well, Tsongkhapa think that a syllogism, or what I've called a probative argument, presuppose that the person who states the argument and the person who receives the argument understand the terms in the same way. So when Madhyamika tried to establish, to prove impermanence to the Vaisheshika, there is no problem. The Madhyamika can see the sound as the same thing as the Vaisheshika see it. We all know the sound, it's something, it's a common object of the senses, and so it is that sound that is impermanent because it is produced. Now, what Tsongkhapa seems to be arguing is that that kind of commonality is lacking in the case of Madhyamika establishing emptiness to non-Madhyamika, right? Madhyamika establishing emptiness to non-Madhyamika. Why is that? Well, because the Madhyamika sees the term, the subject, the sprout is not truly existing because it is dependent arising, for example. The two parties see the subject, the sprout, as different, right? Why is that? Because the Madhyamika, that's the argument, sees the sprout as not really existing, not truly existing, whereas the realist, to whom the argument is addressed by the Madhyamika, sees the sprout, as truly existing, Dendrup. So the argument is that there is no common subject of the argument. This is called in Tibetan Chöchen Tunang or Chöchen Tunang. Chöchen Tunang Yamade charisma, because Madhyamika sees the subject here, let's say the spout, as not truly existing, whereas the realist sees the spout as really existing. And that's why there is no common subject. And that's why you cannot have a probative argument used to establish emptiness when it is stated by a Madhyamika to a non-Madhyamika. Oh, okay. So that's pretty much the core of the matter here. It's important to understand this view, this explanation. That's not an explanation of the difference between Svatantrika and Prasangika accepted by everybody, but that's a difference between Svatantrika and Prasangika as understood by Je Tsongkhapa and the Gelug tradition. So you have these two different views about what I'm talking about today, is with two very different interpretation of view about the difference, the distinction between Svatantrika and Prasangika. One view says this is an interesting distinction, but it's relatively not important. I wouldn't say trivial. I am tempted to say trivial, but that's maybe a little strong. It's a relevant distinction, but it's certainly not a distinction pertaining to the view of emptiness. This is one interpretation. The other interpretation is that this has important implication for understanding emptiness, because the use of autonomous syllogism in the case of establishing emptiness by a Madhyamika for a non-Madhyamika, the insistence of Bhava Viveka to use such a logical tool betrays a kind of unassumed essentialism, a kind of not understanding fully the implications of the view of emptiness. Okay. So hopefully you understand these two very different interpretations of the Svatantrika Prasangika distinction. So obviously a question, who is right? What do you make of the debate? What are they debating about? Well, hopefully I have answered that question. So directly, what? I have no idea. Confirming your speaking language, Italian. Hopefully I speak English. Am I still speaking English? Can everybody understand me? Please let me know if you don't understand. I thought I was speaking English, not Italian, but which I would love to speak, but that's not the point here. So directly, the debate is about the use of autonomous syllogism, Rangyu ki ta or Rangyu ki jorwa. And the question is whether this is an important question that has implications for the view of emptiness, or whether this is a less important question which pertains to the view, the use of various logical tools by Madhyamika when they debate non-Madhyamika. Now, you may wonder how much of a source does Tsongkhapa have. I forgot the exact phrasing, it's in the lecture info, but it's actually pretty, I think Bhava Viveka used the word Rawanki, something like that, like independently. And Tsongkhapa understands this to be to have ontological meaning, meaning that the term of the debate exists independently of the debaters and can be understood in the same way, versus the Prasangika view, which would be that this is not possible. But there is, as in the other case, there is a much more simple interpretation, which is Dharmakya just means by the power of the person who makes the statement. So it's not a very convincing source. Now, what Tsongkhapa maybe has a better point is that he may ask, why is Bhava Viveka? Remember that the distinctions start with Bhava Viveka criticizing Buddha Palita for not stating the proper syllogism, right? The proper probative argument. Okay, so question, legitimate question. Why is Bhava Viveka so bent on providing a syllogism, the proper syllogism? Why not just the prasanga, a statement of consequence? And so you could give it, as you can see, there are going to be several answers. There is going to be a trivial answer who says something like, well, Bhava Viveka is an Indian Pandit. These people are a bit pedantic. They insist on using the most paka, the most proper, the best, the best logical tool, the Indian Pandit and so on. Using prasanga looks a little bit, I was going to say cheap, I'm not sure, but kind of not really the kind of paka Pandit, a really proper Pandit using the proper logical tool. So in that case, the distinction is really not very important because there is, it's not very meaningful. It just reflects who Bhava Viveka was, and so on. There is, however, another interpretation, which is that of Tsongkhapa, obviously, which says that the insistence on using the proper syllogism kind of betrays a kind of gradual grasping to things as truly existing. And that's what Tsongkhapa really is basing himself, because the scriptural sources are pretty thin. But what Tsongkhapa really thinks is that this insistence presupposes there is something like the right method to understand emptiness, and that betrays a kind of residual essentialism or residual grasping to things as existing really. And that's in opposition to Chandrakirti, who use what Buddhists call skillful means. So anything that works, basically good enough, and a prasanga is good enough, and we don't need to be insisting that this is the right. We absolutely need a syllogism because this is the right tool of for proving emptiness. So you see, right there you can see two different interpretations. One pretty trivial, which says, well, the guy is a bit pedantic. What do you expect from an Indian Pandit? And the other is, no, this betrays something a little deeper. Let's dig in and try to find something more meaningful. So okay, so basically that's what I wanted to say. What do I make of the debate? Which side do I embrace? Well, I think it's an interesting debate. And in the monastery, when we were debating, we were encouraged not to come to a premature decision about who is right and who is wrong, and to keep both options as being interesting way to think about things, and not really being pressed to come to a decision. This is an interesting question. Tsongkhapa makes an interesting point, and the other view is also perfectly acceptable. And so I encourage you to entertain both views and to keep thinking about this interesting point, which I think is quite deep, about the Madhyamika view. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Dreyfus. We appreciate any clarification on these very subtle points that are made within these systems, and whether they're made up or not made up. If they get us closer to be able to stop grasping at things as being inherently existent, then distinguishing them is beneficial. If it doesn't, then distinguishing them is not really beneficial. So I appreciate you getting us closer to understanding a little bit about the contributions and the different ways of looking at how these two systems differentiate, whether there's commonly appearing subjects or not, etc. So yeah. One question that I have, it's from your book, actually, The Sound of Two Hands Clapping, and it's really just something I wanted to ask you, how you felt at this point. So Shakargen Nima said to you, we've become really good at debating Madhyamaka philosophy. And he said, but this is not the real understanding of emptiness.
Yep.
For it's bound by conceptual elaborations.
Yes.
We could even defeat a person who'd realized emptiness, he said.
Yes.
He said, such a person would be able to see through our conceptual elaborations, but couldn't answer our questions. So
exactly.
So that was a long time ago that Shakargen Nima said that to you. So
yes.
How do you feel? You've done a lot of inquiry. You have looked at all the different systems in every way, forward and backward, from Galupa all the way around. So how do you feel about that in terms of, in the Action Tantra teachings, it talks about the conceptuality and the studies causing the excitement that actually makes your mind unable to focus in on the object that's needed. So just if you could talk a little bit about that, combining meditation and kind of the calm abiding practices, and how important you think those are, coupled with the kind of intellectual rigor.
Okay. So yeah, this is a big topic again. So let me give you a few thoughts. First, in my mind, I don't believe that there is a difference between the understanding of the various Tibetan schools about emptiness. I think basically they have the same view of emptiness, and that view is exposed differently by different teachers, but it's the same understanding. Now, what Genima was talking about is when you become good at debate, you become quite skilled as navigating this material, but that's not going to help you very much to try to internalize this material. And so it's important to try to think more kind of from one's experience and try to understand this material, not so much in this scholastic way, which is very useful as a training, and it's excellent, but in a more kind of personal and in a way, kind of coarser way, making coarser distinction, but distinction that correspond to how your mind perceives things. And so if you can do that, then slowly you can start to understand, to gain a personal understanding of the view of emptiness, and that has some value. Now, then there is the other side, which is quite different. which is developing samatha, shine, and that's not so easy for most people. But that's a really different endeavor, trying to develop shine. And if you have both of them, then you're doing really well, excellent. This is what you need to have. But samatha requires long retreat. It also requires a particular, at least I'm convinced myself, but this is not really very well explained in the Tibetan literature, but I'm convinced that different people have very different abilities pertaining to the realization of samatha. And this relates to how much attention you have. As you know, one of the terrible diseases of our time is the ADD, the deficiency in attention. And so people who are trained by that are going to have enormous difficulty to achieve samatha. So I think these two things are really quite different. To me, understanding emptiness is much easier than really samatha. I mean, there is no comparison. But, you know, other people are going to find it very different and are going to have a very different experience. And ideally, the two should be brought together. But if you have one of them, you have already something.
Thank you so much. Again, Hopkins always said that. Make it personal. Make this mean something to you in your day and not just be information. So thank you. So we have some questions. If you say that the Svatantrika Prasangika distinction isn't an Indian thing, how do you read the verses from Chandrakirti's supplement that the Dalai Lama often recommends to reflect on daily? Would you say that Chandrakirti didn't intend these verses to make this Svatantrika Prasangika distinction? And did Lama Tsongkhapa just interpret in this way? And I don't have the quote, unfortunately.
Okay,
I have the
okay.
stanza numbers.
I don't know the quote, but no, Chandrakirti did not think that he was dealing with somebody who has a different understanding in emptiness. He thought he was dealing with somebody who did not understand the implication of the logical tools that he was using for the view of emptiness. So he didn't think that Bhava Viveka is not a Madhyamika, which is a debate I have had many times in the debating courtyard, because when you start to think that there is a difference in the view of emptiness between Svatantrika and Prasangika, it becomes a good question. Why the hell are Svatantrika Madhyamika? They don't have the right view. Okay, out. Yeah, sorry, Shantrakshita and Kamrashila, go. You're not Madhyamika. People say, oh, no, I didn't say that, obviously, because that would be terrible to say. That would be a grave, very bad karma to accuse Chandrakshita, who is such an important figure, both for Indian and Tibetan Buddhists, of not being a Madhyamika. But if you took the Geluk interpretation of Madhyamika, there is a serious question. Why Svatantrika a Madhyamika? So what my understanding of Chandrakirti is that he's not talking about the difference in the view. What he's talking about is whether it is proper for Madhyamika to use the tools of the logical tools that the realist use. Now, you understood that I gave you two interpretations about this propriety. One which says, yeah, you know, the guy is a bit uptight, he's an Indian Pandit. What can you do? Use a prasanga if you want. If you don't want, use a syllogism. That's not a big deal. One view. Other views say, no. There is here a more interesting issue, which is Tsongkhapa's view.
So those who debate that, oh, maybe we should throw Chandrashita and Baba Vega out of the middle, where would they put them?
Well, this
There's only four tenets.
this is a reductio ad absurdum, right? It's saying if you really think there is a difference in Prasangika, in the view of emptiness, why are those Madhyamika? And then there is an answer which trying to gloss over the issue, but to me, the issue remains.
I see. And so is it the idea that there are autonomous syllogism, what you believe Tsongkhapa uses as his reasoning to say that they accept inherent existence of all phenomena at a conventional level?
If you want, Tsongkhapa is like a psychoanalyst. The guy says, I'm a Madhyamika, right? And Tsongkhapa say, yeah, but tell me which logical tools you're going to use. And the guy is an uptight pundit and says, we need a prayoga. We need a proper syllogism. And Tsongkhapa say, look, see, you're still holding to something. Now, you know, psychoanalysts are not absurd. They're a little strange. They're a little twisted, but they're not absurd. They have a point. And so Tsongkhapa may have a point too. So this is what I think is helpful to understand.
Thank you so much. So do you feel that Chandrakirti made a distinction between true existence and inherent existence at a conventional level based on your readings?
I don't remember my reading exactly, but I wouldn't think so.
Okay, thank you.
I think I'm not sure where it comes from, but I assume it's Tsongkhapa, but it could predate Tsongkhapa, I'm not sure. I mean, this looks like a Tibetan.
I see.
Yeah, a Tibetan
construction.
Distinction, yeah.
Thank you, thank you. In online discussion forums, which I admit are not reliable, I have heard the Galut interpretation of Madhyamaka described pejoratively as a crypto-Svatantrika view, mainly due to its insistence that a pillar, for example, is empty of existence, but not empty of being a pillar. I see. This seems to be argued. It proves that Galupas believe that any given object has some inherent characteristics. They are empty of swabhava, not bhava. What do you think of this criticism?
But it completely missed the point. I mean, there is a valid. There is a plausible accusation towards Tsongkhapa that he is really a Svatantrika. That's a plausible accusation. But the people who make this accusation think that there is no difference in the view of emptiness between Svatantrika and Prasangika. So it's not saying Tsongkhapa is a realist. It's saying Tsongkhapa is so in love with Buddhist logic used for proving emptiness, he's really a Svatantrika because this is what Svatantrikas are.
I see.
But this is absolutely has nothing to do with the issue of whether the proper emptiness is emptiness of svabhava or emptiness of bhava, because if you look at the Indian text, it's clear that it's neither bhava nor abhava. So good luck. What is it? Tell me. And other interpretation of Madhyamika deconstruction make it clear that they are not deconstructing the pillar or the conventional object as such, but they are deconstructing a particular way of being for that we superimpose about that object, right? So I think that's not a valid criticism at all, right?
Thank you. Can you please share more about your time at UVA with Professor Hopkins? Do you have anything else to share?
Not very much, because my time at UVA was spent learning anything but Buddhism, because, or at least Tibetan Buddhism, because Jeffrey understood that, I was pretty good enough with at least Geluk tradition, right? I learned about the Sakya later when I did the research. So I focused mostly on Western philosophy. I also took some courses on a course on Japanese Buddhism, which was a little bit a problem because I kept fighting with the professor, saying, this is not really Buddhist. And the professor was not happy with me. And so we had a bit of a problem because I was out of Geluk Academy, right? And I had a very pretty rigid, a pretty narrow view of what's Buddhist and what's not Buddhist. And the professor was like, George, this is Japanese Buddhist, just leave it alone. When we became later great friends, when I understood that, we can relax and see it in a more anthropological way, right? We don't need to fight about what's the right view and so on. So, yeah, that was an interesting experience.
In the presentation by John Powers, he said that the 8th and 9th Karmapas asserted that Nagarjuna said that I have no thesis. How does this relate to the question of whether an autonomous syllogism is needed to prove emptiness to non-madhyamikas?
That's a slightly different issue. It does relate in the sense that the question is whether, to which extent can Madhyamika make assertions, right? And positive and negative are really the same. But let's simplify and talk about positive assertions, right? So Madhyamika deconstruct objects, right? So it's neither existing, nor non-existing, nor both, nor neither, and so on, right? This is the fourfold, the Chatushkoti, right? One of the most basic Madhyamika schemata to deconstruct common notions, right? Objects. So what does it mean? And can you say anything? Now, there's 8 Karmapa, right? I mean, the 7. Yeah, the 7 too. But anyway, the 8 Karmapa says, yeah, there is nothing to say. You cannot say anything because there is no thesis that you can have. Now, the question is then what can you say? And then obviously you have to make a distinction between the two and talk about from the point of ignorance, you can talk about object and so on, right? That's the Karmapa's view of no thesis. Tsongkhapa has a very different view because he thinks that emptiness should be understood through identifying the object to be negated. And that's where it goes back to the Prasangika Svatantrika distinction, because Tsongkhapa thinks there is a difference between the object of negation understood by Svatantrika and the object of negation understood by Prasangika, right? And so he thinks that to understand emptiness, you need to identify the object of negation in the right way and then negating it or deconstructing it, right? And so when you do that, you identify like something Rangane Drupa as the object to be, or Rangitseniki Drupa as the object to be deconstructed. And then you say, yeah, the Madhyamika reasoning of neither is nor is not and so on is not about bhava or abhava, is about bhava and abhava understood through the object of negation, right? And so when you do that, you, instead of saying, I cannot say anything about emptiness, all I can do is undo things, deconstruct, then that's the Karmapa view. Tsongkhapa said, no, you can say emptiness is the empty, the absence of intrinsic existence, Rangane Drupe Tompa, right? And so you can say that, and you can say also that things exist because they exist conventionally, and so on. And so the object, the identification of the object of negation allows you to break the distinction, if you want, between the two truths in terms of discourse, because now discourse can apply to every object, including emptiness, right? Whereas if you had the Karmapa, you say, all what I can say is it's not this, it's not that, it's not bhava, it's not abhava, it's neither both, it's neither. Good luck.
Just not.
Not, exactly.
Just not.
No.
No. Speaking of Rangitseni Drupa, can you explain the sense of Rangitseni Drupa as it explains to the debate, to debate?
What do you mean?
I don't know.
Rangitseni Drupa is the same as Rangane Drupa. It means it has its own
defining characteristics established by its own.
No, it has its own characteristic. Here, Rangitseni doesn't mean the same as Tseni and so on. It just means kind of unique characteristic, right? And so for Tsongkhapa, but that's I think it's good. That's obviously the wrong way to understand reality, because you need to understand reality as dependent arising, not being defined or by its own special intrinsic characteristics, right? And so I think this makes a lot of sense in Madhyamika. That's why I think both interpretations are useful to keep in mind, because they each bring to the table interesting support for understanding the view.
We have been advised to ask for your expert view on the prevalence of the Chittamatra view in Tibet. If you could please elaborate. So there was an assertion that some of the lamas were actually mind-only school teachers. Maybe you had told someone, mind-only school holders.
I wouldn't use the words mind-only. I would use the word Yogacara.
Yogacara.
Yeah, that's different. So yes, I remember asking Digo Khyentse, I think it's Digo Khyentse, I'm not sure, but I think whether Dzogchen, followers of Dzogchen, accept external objects. And I think his answer was, I don't know any Dzogchen who thinks that there is an external object. So I think non-Geluk, some non-Geluk, particularly Nyingma, that I know a little bit better. I know nothing about Kagyu, but Nyingma are very fond of Yogacara, which they interpret as being compatible with Madhyamika. So this is why I make a difference between mind-only and Yogacara, because mind-only, I use the term mind-only Chittamatra to only for the view that the mind is real and duality is not real. And so that kind of view has a kind of residual essentialist because it views the mind as real. There is a wide spectrum of view that I would characterize as Yogacara, which do not hold this view, hold that, everything is insubstantial, but nevertheless, the three characteristics, the Thinisum way of looking at reality is a great way to understand how we can understand emptiness from a meditative point of view. And so for these people, there is no contradiction between Yogacara and Madhyamika. They are Yogacharan because they don't accept external objects, right?
Would they accept the emptiness of emptiness?
Sure.
So this thoroughly established nature they would consider empty of inherent existence in the Yogacara?
In the Yogacara, sure. You're not Madhyamika if you don't accept the emptiness of emptiness. You are maybe great Madhyamika, like Gentong, like the Janampa, right? But if you don't accept the emptiness of emptiness, you're not a Madhyamika. That's a key point, is the emptiness of emptiness, right? Because holding to essentializing reality, holding things as intrinsically existent is a sickness. It's a sickness of ignorance. And so if you essentialize emptiness, you are described by Nagarjuna as being incurable because you transform the medicine into a poison. And so we can't do anything for you. So emptiness of emptiness is extraordinarily important. It's a key point of the Madhyamika, right? And so, but there are people in Tibet who think that Madhyamika is compatible with Yogacharan. That's one view. And then there are views that in Tibet that hold to a more kind of essentialized view of consciousness. And that's at least one version of the Gentong view, one version, because there are many versions of Gentong. So Mipam is a Gentongpa in a way, but that's not the same Gentong. His Holiness used to say Gentong Nakpo. I'm not sure the people who hold this view would be very happy to hear it described in this way, but anyway, that's what he said. I'm just reporting.
Just a reporter.
Yes.
So why did you feel the need to go outside of the Gelug school in your studies of the Buddhist teachings, and specifically your pursuit of the understanding of emptiness?
I didn't need to go outside of the Gelug school to understand emptiness. That's not the point. I went outside of the Gelug school to understand other aspects of Tibetan Buddhists, such as Dzogchen, very rudimentary understanding of Tantra and so on. So there are other aspects to Tibetan Buddhism besides Madhyamika, but I was perfectly happy as a staunch Gelugpa follower of Genima as far as emptiness is concerned. Then when I started to study the other school, I started to understand their view. And, I'm a scholar, so I found this intrinsically interesting. And I was confirmed in my view that there is not much difference, but there are interesting distinctions to be made. So it's a valuable topic of study, but basically, at least the part of Tibetan Buddhism that holds to the Madhyamika view instead of the great Madhyamika, the part of Tibetan Buddhism that holds to Madhyamika view, basically have very similar view about the nature of reality. And, once you start also trying to internalize this view, you realize that people who phrasing might be questionable might actually have a really insight much superior to your own. Though the phrasing might be problematic and I might be able to take them in a debate, right? And that was taught to me by Genima himself. He said, you know, we are very, he meant me, but he said, we are very smart as debate, we can debate with other people and we make life difficult for other people. But if we encounter somebody who understands emptiness, we would be able to debate him, but we would not have the same insight.
Let me see. Last question. Gen Hopkins had a huge appreciation for Jayan Sheba. In your studies of the different monastic curriculums, did you find something special within Jayan Sheba's presentations yourself that were kind of clarifiers or differentiators? I know that Shakar Gen Nemo was appreciative of Jayan Sheba's presentation of emptiness. So I was just curious if you found anything special in there compared to Panchen Sonandrapa or Jitsamba, etc.
That's where there is a kind of unreconcilable difference between Jeffrey and me. It's about Jamil Shepa. I read some Jamil Shepa, but not a whole lot. For me, the Yiksha, the textbooks of the monastery are great. I mean, they're really useful. But obviously, you should not limit yourself to that. That's a textbook. Then you have to go on to Tsongkhapa, and you have to go on to other Tibetan, Indian sources, and so on, right? And so I was educated by the teacher who said, yeah, Yiksha is interesting, but it's not. So I never paid much. I mean, I read Jamil Sheba, it's not uninteresting, but I never paid much attention. I didn't spend a lot of time on Jamil Shepa. I did my Yiksha and then Tsongkhapa and then the other Tibetan schools.
Wonderful. Well, I think that is all of the questions that we have. So appreciative of your talk, Professor Dreyfus. We really, really appreciate it.
Could I ask one from the audience?
Yeah. Oh, yeah, of course.
Okay. Yeah. So, George, I'm quite interested in people distinguishing Yogacarya and Chittamadra because in China, they're seen as the same.
Yes.
And so, yeah, please describe how this came about and what exactly are the differences. It sounds like it relates a lot to Great Madhyamika.
No, it doesn't. Well, it could relate to Great Madhyamika, but that would be an unfortunate association in my mind, at least. But no, you're right. The term I use pretty freely. So I make a distinction, which I forgot where I found it, but it's not systematically observed. So I make this distinction between Chittamatran who hold the mind to be real and other people who I call Yogacharin who hold the mind not to be real. Now, this is an important distinction, but the fact that I call them differently is not particularly meaningful because I'm sure you can see this term used pretty freely. But it is a really important issue whether we are going to have an idealist view which privilege the mind and hold the mind to be consciousness to be real, or whether we have a real Madhyamika view, which is hold onto nothing, right? To no thing. Yeah.
So what you're calling Yogacarya do they assert external objects, or do they say that,
Probably not. But remember, probably not. Remember what Dingo Khyentse Rinpoche said. He said he doesn't know a Dzogchen Pa who asserts external objects. So asserting external object is not a distinction of Chittamatra, because there is an important distinction to be made between the people who reify consciousness and the people who don't reify consciousness. And for me, the people who don't hold external object to, who hold external object to be existing conventionally, these people can be Madhyamika.
Yeah. Okay.
That's not a problem. That's not the key issue, from my point of view. Now, in the Gelugpa way of looking at things, that's not what I said is not acceptable, right? Because Yogacara and Chittamatra are the same, and Gelug thinks that Yogacara and you hold the mind, consciousness to be real. Now, when you look at the actual Indian text, like the Vimshatika and the Trimshika, I forgot which one of the two, you can see that actually that's not the case. That's holding the mind, the consciousness to be real is one step, but the final step is when you have deconstructed the whole thing and you're left with no thing. That's the Indian text. So please look at the Indian text.
So when you say holding the mind to not be real, do you mean in terms of the way that we would say the Yogacara Svatantrika Madhyamaka?
Yeah,
feels something like this?
Yeah. Now, in Dzogchen, the mind is not real. It's empty, but it's also clear, luminous, and so on, right? So you have different way of understanding how that works. But basically, Svatantrika Yogacara would be an example.
Anyone else?
You can debate.
We can debate. I was hoping we weren't going to start that this evening, but secretly hoping we were going to start that this evening. All right. If we don't have any more questions, I just want to say thank you so much, Professor Dreyfus. We appreciate you so much. We appreciate your mind. And thank you for letting us kind of ask a lot of different varying types of questions, because this is a topic that many of us look at, and then it's hard to distinguish between what exactly we're talking about, existing through its own objective mode of being, not through being posited through the power of appearing to the mind versus, just merely imputed by the mind. And what's the difference there? So I appreciate you helping us to understand consequences versus autonomous syllogisms, commonly appearing subjects, objects, and so forth, to help us distinguish those views. And it's interesting, to hear you say that the idea that they hold on to these autonomous syllogisms so much is the reasoning Tsongkhapa uses to kind of get in the door of that they posit things to inherently exist. So I appreciate that insight. Okay, so thanks again, and thank you to Sravasti Abbey, as usual, for hosting the event, for doing all the technical stuff that I have no idea how to do, for doing such wonderful advertising, and just making sure that everyone gets to hear this wonderful series. I cannot believe that it's going to be number 10 next week. I remember looking at Professor Dreyfus's talk and saying, oh my gosh, that's all the way at the end of after October, and it came up so quickly as time just keeps going by so fast. So thank you. And next week, the second to last installment of the series, number 10, with Dan Kozort, Professor Dan Kozort, teaching on the Diamond Sutra on 4 delusions regarding impermanence. So everyone's excited about that. And now let's dedicate the immense merit created from listening to this pure teaching from the King of Prayers. I dedicate all this virtue to emulate the knowledge of the hero Manjushri and likewise Samantabhadra as well. With whatever dedication is praised as supreme by all the conquerors who traverse the three times, I also dedicate all my roots of virtue for the sake of auspicious deeds. Thanks again, everybody. And if you wish to donate to UMA, you can go into the chat box and go to the Sravasti Abbey website to the donation page. Thanks again, Professor Dreyfus, and we'll see you next time. Take care, everybody.